In the fall of 2004, the sitting boss of the Bonanno crime family was wearing a wire. He was not wearing it under duress, or under orders, or in the disoriented hours after an arrest. He had requested the arrangement himself. He had asked for a private meeting with the judge who would decide whether he spent the rest of his life in a cell or walked out of federal custody, and when that meeting produced a cooperation agreement, he agreed to its terms and put the recording device under his clothes and went back inside to record the conversations of the man he had personally chosen to succeed him. Behind the device under his clothes was a criminal career that stretched back more than 30 years, through murders and hijackings and labor rackets, and the complete reconstruction of an organization that everyone else had abandoned as finished. The man wearing the wire had built a criminal empire on the principle that silence was the only protection that worked, that visibility was an organization's greatest vulnerability, that the men who survived in his world were the ones who understood how to disappear into their own neighborhoods while commanding everything that happened in them. He had told his soldiers at the ceremony where he inducted them into the oath that bound them to his organization that once a bullet leaves that gun, you never talk about it. He was now talking about everything. The man was Joseph Massino, known by the nickname Big Joey, known in the final years of his reign by the title the federal investigation gave him, the Last Don. The man he was recording was Vincent Basciano, the acting boss of the Bonanno crime family, and the story of how a man who understood better than anyone in his world how silence protected an organization came to be the instrument of that organization's most complete and deliberate destruction is a story that begins not in a federal facility in Brooklyn in 2004, but in a working class neighborhood in Queens in 1943. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. The range of places that come in every video is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Maspeth, Queens, and the man who built everything and then took it apart. Joseph Charles Massino was born on January 10th, 1943, in Maspeth, a working-class neighborhood in the borough of Queens in New York City. He was one of three sons of Anthony and Adeline Massino, both of Neapolitan American background. The neighborhood of Maspeth in the 1940s and 1950s was organized around the industries that employed its residents, the docks and the freight infrastructure, and the small manufacturing operations that gave a working-class Italian-American family a livelihood, and around the organizations that controlled what happened to those industries. The distinction between those two things, between the legitimate commerce and the criminal organizations that extracted a share of it, was not a distinction that everyone in the neighborhood felt compelled to maintain. By his own later admission in federal court, Massino was a juvenile delinquent by the age of 12. He claimed to have run away from home to Florida at 14. He dropped out of Grover Cleveland High School in 10th grade and completed his formal education before he was old enough to vote. What came next was an informal education conducted in the streets of Maspeth and its surrounding neighborhoods, an education in the specific skills and relationships and organizational cultures of Queens criminal life in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1956, Massino met a woman named Josephine Vitale. He married her in 1960. The couple had 3 daughters together. The marriage connected him permanently to her brother, Salvatore Vitale, who had served briefly in the United States Army before returning to the neighborhood and the criminal world that Massino was already navigating. The relationship between Joseph Massino and Salvatore Vitale would define the next 4 decades of both their lives, through partnership and proximity, and eventually through a betrayal whose consequences neither man could have imagined in the early years when they were running numbers from a lunch wagon together. The lunch wagon was Massino's first criminal headquarters. He operated it in Maspeth, selling pastries and coffee to dock workers while running a numbers operation and a loan sharking book from the same vehicle. It was a modest beginning for a man who would eventually command the second most powerful criminal organization in New York City, but it demonstrated from the earliest stage the combination of legitimate cover and criminal enterprise that would characterize everything he built afterward. The catering company he later opened, called J&J Catering, was the same principle at a larger scale. By the late 1960s, Massino had assembled a truck hijacking crew that included Vitale and a carjacker named Dwayne Leisenheimer. The crew operated at the high end of the hijacking trade, intercepting valuable cargo loads and moving the merchandise through a fencing network Massino controlled. It was in this world, the world of men who made their livings by taking what was on trucks, that Massino formed the friendship that would shape the most consequential choices of his adult life. John Gotti was then a young man running his own hijacking operations in Queens, building his reputation through exactly the same activities, absorbing the same organizational culture, and accumulating the same kind of standing in the criminal world that the neighborhood produced in abundance. They were not yet the figures they would become. They were truck hijackers from Queens with energy and ambition, and no particular inhibition about what they were willing to do to advance themselves. They would eventually become neighbors in Howard Beach, Queens, and they would eat dinner together on Sunday evenings for years, and they would rise simultaneously through their respective organizations to positions of authority that neither of their early associates could have predicted from the lunch wagon and the hijacking crews. The friendship was genuine and deep and rooted in a shared world. The difference between them, the difference that would matter more than anything else about either man's career, was a difference in what they believed about how an organization survives. That difference was not yet visible when they were hijackers. It would become visible over the following decades in the most consequential way imaginable. In 1975, Massino and Vitale participated in the murder of a Bonanno family associate named Vito Borelli at the direction of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Massino would later testify that Gotti was primarily responsible for the killing. The Borelli murder was significant because of what it established. Massino had proven his willingness to kill on behalf of the organization he was seeking to join as a full member, and had moved measurably closer to induction into the world he had been orbiting since the lunch wagon in Maspeth. His mentor in this transition was Philip Rastelli, a Maspeth-based captain who recognized in Massino the combination of operational ability, loyalty, and organizational intelligence that the Bonanno family needed in the years that lay ahead. Rastelli called himself Unc to the young men around him. Massino adopted the name with the affection of someone who understood what the relationship was worth. Philip Rastelli had been maneuvering toward the Bonanno boss position for years, and his protection of and investment in Massino was part of a larger project of building the loyalist faction that would eventually give him undisputed control of the family. What he found in the young man from Maspeth was someone who understood the organizational principles Rastelli believed in: discretion, loyalty, the specific kind of patience that allows a man to wait for the right moment rather than forcing events before they are ready. Natale Evola, the Bonanno boss, died in 1973. On February 23, 1974, at a meeting at the Americana Hotel in Manhattan, the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, named Rastelli as his successor. The succession lasted approximately 2 years before Rastelli's legal troubles intervened. Convicted of extortion on April the 23rd, 1976, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison on August 27th of the same year and disappeared into the federal prison system, leaving the Bonanno family without an active boss at a moment when the organization was already under pressure from several directions at once. The man who moved into the vacancy that Rastelli's imprisonment created was Carmine Galante. Galante had been a Bonanno consigliere before his own imprisonment on narcotics charges, and his return to the streets put him in a position he moved to exploit immediately. His plan was an aggressive expansion into the heroin trade, using a network of Sicilian-born associates known informally as the Zips, who operated independently of the existing family structure and reported directly to him. Galante was not subtle about his ambitions or his methods, and the other New York families began to understand that what he was building was not just a drug operation, but a bid for a kind of dominance that the Commission had been designed to prevent. Massino understood what Galante's ascent meant for Rastelli's faction and for his own position within it. He was by now deeply invested in the Rastelli project, and Galante's consolidation of power was a direct threat to everything Rastelli had been building. Massino carried the request to the commission on Rastelli's behalf. Galante needed to be removed. The commission reviewed the situation and approved the sanction. On July the 12th, 1979, three men walked into Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn and shot Carmine Galante dead in the garden while he ate lunch. The cigar he had been smoking was still clenched between his teeth when his body was photographed. The image produced the most widely reproduced crime scene photograph in the history of American organized crime, the specific kind of visibility that Massino was already learning to regard as a warning about what ambition looks like when it forgets the importance of disappearing. The reward for his loyalty in carrying the Galante sanction to the commission was promotion to captain. Massino now ran his crew from the J&S Cake Social Club in Maspeth, a property just behind his catering operation that served as the organizational heart of his operation. His standing in the family had advanced measurably, his relationship with Rastelli had deepened, and the Bonanno family, freed from Galante's attempt to redirect it into a vehicle for his personal ambitions, was entering a period of internal conflict that would require the specific kind of decisive action that Massino had demonstrated he was capable of. The internal conflict that followed Galante's death was not about ideology or organizational direction. It was about who would hold power in a family whose boss was imprisoned and whose operating structure had been destabilized by years of upheaval. Two factions formed around competing loyalties. On one side were Rastelli loyalists, including Massino and a captain named Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black. On the other side were three captains who had decided that Rastelli's prison-based leadership was no longer acceptable and who had begun taking steps to replace it. The three men were Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red, Dominic Trinchera, known as Big Trin, and Philip Giacone, known as Phil Lucky. In the early months of 1981, Massino received intelligence that the three rebel captains were not merely dissatisfied with Rastelli's leadership, but were actively preparing for violence. They were stockpiling automatic weapons. They were consolidating support within the family. The timeline for action, the intelligence suggested, was short. Massino took the information to two of the most powerful figures on the commission, Colombo boss Carmine Persico and Gambino boss Paul Castellano. The advice they gave him was immediate and unambiguous. Act now. Massino's response was to arrange a peace meeting. The meeting was set for the evening of May 5th, 1981, at the 2020 nightclub in the Clinton Hill neighborhood of Brooklyn. The three rebel captains were invited to attend for the purpose of working out a settlement to the factional dispute. Protocol in their world required men to arrive at a peace meeting unarmed. The three captains arrived as the protocol required. They were unarmed. Inside the club, in a storage room behind the main space, four men wearing masks had been waiting in a closet. Among them were Salvatore Vitale and Vito Rizzuto, a Sicilian-born mobster with connections to the Rizzuto crime family in Montreal, who had traveled to New York to participate in the operation. When Massino and his associates escorted the three captains into the storage room, a man named Gerlando Sciascia ran his hand through his hair, the prearranged signal. The closet opened. Rizzuto called out that it was a holdup. The three captains were unarmed and had no path to safety. Massino threw a punch at Phil Giacone that knocked him to the floor and prevented Indelicato from reaching the door. Giacone struggled to his feet and tried to run, but was pinned against a wall beside Trinchera. The gunmen cut them down with submachine gun fire. Indelicato, still alive briefly after being shot in the back and in his side, was shot in the left side of the head before he could reach the door. The three bodies were dead in the storage room of the 2020 nightclub within minutes of the signal. One man survived. Frank Lino, who had been escorted to the club as an additional observer, found an unlocked door in the chaos and ran through it. He kept running. He would eventually be brought into Massino's camp and would remain a Bonanno figure for years before his own eventual cooperation with federal prosecutors. The three bodies were transported after the killings to a lot in the Lindenwood section of Ozone Park Queens, a low-lying area of vacant land on the border between Brooklyn and Queens that had been used as a burial ground by the Gambino family for years. John Gotti, then a Gambino captain building his own reputation, made arrangements for his men to bury the Bonanno bodies there as a favor to Massino. The burial was intended to be permanent. Indelicado's body was discovered by authorities on May 28, 1981, less than a month after the killings. The bodies of Trinchera and Giaccone remained undisturbed in the earth at Lindenwood for more than 20 years. They would not be found until October 2004, when some children reported finding remains in the lot and FBI agents arrived to excavate. Among the personal items unearthed with the remains was a Piaget watch that had belonged to Giaccone's wife and a credit card bearing Trinchera's name. The identifications were confirmed in December 2004. The triple murder had solved the immediate factional problem. Rastelli's loyalists now controlled the Bonanno family without organized internal opposition. Massino's standing in the organization had risen sharply, and the operation he had planned and executed, its precision, its use of protocol to disarm the targets, its advance arrangements for body disposal, demonstrated an operational intelligence that the people who needed to evaluate such things were now fully aware of. But the 1981 calendar had not finished producing its crises. The infiltration of FBI agent Joseph Pistone had begun in September 1976. Pistone operated under the alias Donnie Brasco, presenting himself as a jewel thief and fence with connections useful to organized crime, and worked his way through the Bonanno family's social world over nearly 6 years. His assignment had been intended to last approximately 6 months. It stretched into something far longer and far more damaging because the men around him trusted what they saw and never looked beneath it. Massino had been suspicious of Brasco from an early point. Something about the man's presentation did not sit correctly with him, and he instructed the people around him to keep their distance. His instincts were correct. Pistone was building a case that would eventually support more than 100 convictions, but in the crew of Captain Dominic Napolitano, Sonny Black, Pistone had found a champion willing to stake his standing on the young man's reliability. Napolitano had integrated Pistone into his operations, used him on sensitive assignments, and was actively maneuvering to have him formally inducted into the family as a made man. The FBI pulled Pistone out of the operation on July 26, 1981. Within days, the Bonanno family's leadership understood what had happened. An FBI agent had been operating inside their organization for 6 years. He had attended meetings, seen faces, heard conversations, and collected evidence of sufficient weight to produce prosecutions that would run for years. The man who had welcomed him into his crew and had nearly gotten him inducted into the family was Dominic Napolitano. Massino's documented response to this situation was phrased in the specific language of his world. He told Vitale that he had to give Napolitano a receipt for the Donnie Brasco situation. On August 17, 1981, Napolitano was collected by Frank Lino and driven to a house in Brooklyn. He was brought down to the basement and shot. Napolitano's body was discovered in a creek on Staten Island in August 1982, nearly a year after his murder. It was found with its hands cut off. People who later described the reason for that particular detail said it was meant to deliver a message about what happens when an undercover agent shakes hands with a made man. Napolitano had known or suspected what was coming. In the days before August 17th, he had given his jewelry to his favorite bartender and left the keys to his apartment with a friend so that someone could look after his pet pigeons. Joseph Pistone, who learned of Napolitano's fate, would later say that his intention had never been to get anyone killed and that he was sorry. Napolitano had reportedly said, through channels that eventually reached Pistone years later, that if someone was going to take him down, he was glad it was Pistone. Benjamin Ruggiero, known as Lefty, who had been Pistone's primary contact in the family and had helped him build his early standing, was also targeted for murder after the infiltration was exposed. He was en route to the meeting where he was expected to be killed when FBI agents arrested him on August 29th, 1981. He received 15 years under the RICO statute. Anthony Mira, the soldier who had first introduced Pistone to the Bonanno world and was held responsible for the initial breach, was murdered on Massino's orders on February 18th, 1982. The consequences of the Pistone infiltration extended beyond the internal murders it produced. The commission expelled the Bonanno family as punishment for allowing an undercover federal agent to operate inside their ranks for 6 years. The Bonannos lost their seat on the table at which the most powerful criminal organizations in America made their collective decisions. They were, in the formal institutional sense, finished. The expulsion that seemed like the final humiliation of an already troubled organization turned out to be, through a logic that nobody could have predicted at the time, one of the conditions that made Massino's eventual reconstruction of the family possible. The FBI, by the middle of the 1980s, had redirected its major organized crime resources toward the 4 families that still held commission seats. The Bonannos, having been declared irrelevant, received proportionally less attention. The most consequential federal organized crime prosecution of the era, the Mafia Commission trial of 1985 and 1986, targeted the bosses of those 4 families and produced convictions that sent each of them to prison for the rest of their lives. The Bonannos were not on the commission and were not among the primary targets. In the long accounting of the 1980s, being expelled had given them a measure of protection. But before Massino could benefit from any of this, he had his own legal problems to manage. In November of 1981, 6 Bonanno members were indicted on racketeering charges based on information from the Pistone operation. Massino was tipped off in March of 1982 by a source with connections to the Colombo family and to law enforcement that an indictment was coming for him as well. He went into hiding in Milford, Pennsylvania, with Leisenheimer. From Pennsylvania, while technically a fugitive, he continued to operate. Gotti made the trip to Pennsylvania to visit his friend during the concealment, and Vitale delivered cash to support him during the period he remained underground. In April of 1984, still in hiding, Massino ordered the murder of Cesare Bonventre, a Sicilian-born captain who had been leading the family's Sicilian faction and whose continued independence Massino regarded as a problem. Bonventre was shot in a garage in Queens, transported to a warehouse in Garfield, New Jersey, and placed into 2 55-gallon glue drums. The drums were discovered on April 16, 1984, after a tip reached investigators. Massino surrendered on July 7, 1984, and was released on $350,000 bail. By this point, his standing in the family, despite 2 years spent hiding in Pennsylvania, was not in question. He was recognized as the Bonanno underboss, and with Rastelli's health declining, he was understood by most of the people who needed to understand such things as the operating head of the organization. The labor racketeering trial that began in April of 1986 included Massino among 12 defendants, alongside Rastelli and former underboss Nicholas Maranghello. Massino was implicated by testimony from Pistone and from a union official named Anthony Gilberti. On October 15, 1986, he was found guilty of racketeering charges for accepting kickbacks on the Bonanno family's behalf. On January 16, 1987, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, his first prison term. Rastelli, also convicted and in deteriorating health, received 12 years. A separate trial in April of 1987 addressed the conspiracy to murder the 3 captains killed on May 5, 1981. The result was an acquittal on the murder conspiracy charges. The killings had occurred outside the 5-year statute of limitations that governed the RICO charges, and without evidence that a continuing criminal enterprise extended into the indictment period, the murder conspiracy did not survive legal challenge. Massino and Vitale were convicted only on hijacking counts. The men he had helped kill in the storage room at the 2020 nightclub would not produce a legal consequence that could add to his prison time. He served his 10-year sentence. Philip Rastelli died on June 24, 1991, while Massino was still imprisoned. Shortly after Rastelli's death, Vitale convened a meeting of the family's captains. They acclaimed Massino as boss, the man who had been waiting for this moment for more than a decade, who had spent years building his reputation and his relationships and his understanding of what needed to change and how the Bonannos operated, was now the official head of an organization that had spent the better part of 25 years in turmoil. He was 49 years old. He understood that if he was careful and disciplined and applied the lessons his predecessors had failed to learn, he potentially had a long tenure ahead of him. Massino was released from federal prison on supervised release on November 13th, 1992. The terms of his supervised release prohibited him from associating with convicted mafiosi, which created an immediate operational problem. His underboss, the man he needed to communicate with while he was rebuilding the family and could not openly attend meetings himself, was Vitale, who, despite decades of criminal activity at Massino's side, had never been convicted of a mafia-related crime. Massino designated Vitale as his messenger. The FBI had reason to suspect Vitale was involved in organized crime, but no legal grounds to prohibit his association with his own brother-in-law. The arrangement worked precisely because it exploited the gap between what federal investigators suspected and what they could establish in a courtroom. As the supervised release period ended and Massino assumed full operational control, he began implementing a set of reforms that would transform the Bonanno family into something qualitatively different from what it had been before. The changes were specific, practical, and rooted in the lessons of the previous 25 years. He closed every social club the family had operated. The social clubs, the storefront headquarters, where captains and soldiers gathered and were photographed by surveillance units and bugged by electronic devices installed during break-ins, were finished. Meetings would happen in remote locations, in moving vehicles, in restaurants at off hours, or in other countries. The FBI's ability to physically observe and record who met with whom in a fixed location was a structural vulnerability that Massino simply eliminated. He forbade the members of the organization from speaking his name. When soldiers needed to refer to him in conversation, they were to touch their ear, a gesture that law enforcement surveillance eventually decoded. The discovery of this convention earned Massino a second nickname, separate from the Big Joey derived from his weight, the ear. He decentralized the family's operational structure into clandestine cells. Crews were forbidden from contacting one another directly. A committee of senior members relayed his decisions through a chain that made it harder for law enforcement to map the hierarchy or to understand, from any individual arrest or wiretap, how the whole organization was structured. He created a requirement that any associate seeking induction into the family had to work for the organization for at least 8 years before being considered. This was not a bureaucratic rule. It was a vetting mechanism designed to reduce the probability that the person standing in the induction room was either an undercover federal agent or someone who had been compromised by federal agents. The family's economic focus shifted. The high-profile truck hijackings that had built Massino's early reputation were finished. They attracted attention and produced arrests and were, in the calculus of organizational survival, not worth their earnings. The Bonanno family under Massino moved toward labor union racketeering, toward the construction industry and the garment district, toward private sanitation, toward stock manipulation schemes, toward the loan sharking and gambling operations that generated reliable income without the profile of armed robbery. These were the kinds of rackets that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all, and that generated income for years without drawing the specific kind of federal attention that came with violence and spectacle. The maid membership of the Bonanno family grew from approximately 80 members in the early 1990s to approximately 110 by the end of the decade. The commission seat that had been stripped from the family in the wake of the Pistone infiltration was restored, in part through Massino's friendship with Gotti, who used his influence as Gambino boss to support the Bonanno's return to the governing table. By the late 1990s, federal investigators ranked the Bonannos as the second most powerful of the 5 families, behind only the Genovese organization. By 1998, Massino was the only full-fledged New York boss who was not in prison. The title that followed from that status was the one that would define his public identity for the final years of his free life, the Last Don. At 6215 60th Lane in Maspeth, Queens, the Casablanca restaurant was operating as an Italian restaurant and catering firm under the inscription where you are treated like family. Its owner greeted guests himself, seated them personally, and sometimes emerged from the kitchen to explain what he had prepared that evening. He was known in the neighborhood as a man who cooked well and ran a good establishment, and had strong opinions about food that he shared with the generosity of someone who genuinely enjoyed the activity. In January of 2000, he convened a meeting at the restaurant that included the acting bosses of 4 of the 5 families of New York, a gathering that represented the largest concentration of organized crime authority in the country under a single roof, conducted over a meal in a restaurant in Maspeth, Queens. 1 block away in Howard Beach, John Gotti was demonstrating, for the benefit of anyone paying attention, what it looked like when an organization chose to operate without the discipline that Massino had spent a decade installing. Gotti held his weekly captain meetings at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, where FBI surveillance teams photographed the procession of Gambino family members arriving to pay their respects to the new boss. He gave interviews. He waved to cameras. He was known as the Dapper Don, a reference to his tailored suits and silk ties, and later as the Teflon Don, a reference to his repeated acquittals in federal cases that had failed to produce convictions. He understood his public image as a kind of power in itself, the projection of authority through visibility, and he pursued that image with the same energy he brought to his criminal operations. The 2 men were neighbors. They had been friends since the hijacking days of the 1960s. They ate dinner together on Sunday evenings, and the friendship was genuine enough that Gotti had traveled to Pennsylvania to visit Massino during the 2 years he had spent hiding from his indictment. But Massino was watching what the friendship demonstrated about the 2 different choices available to a man in their position, and what he saw confirmed everything he already believed. Informants later testified that Massino said of Gotti, "John set this thing of ours back 100 years. On December 11th, 1990, FBI agents and New York police detectives raided the Ravenite Social Club. Gotti was arrested alongside his underboss Salvatore Gravano, and the evidence assembled against him included recordings made in an apartment above the Ravenite, recordings that captured conversations about murder and organizational decisions that Gotti had believed were private. On April 2nd, 1992, a jury convicted Gotti of 5 murders, racketeering, obstruction of justice, illegal gambling, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in federal custody on June 10, 2002. His organization, once the most powerful family in New York, did not recover in any meaningful sense from his conviction. Massino absorbed this outcome and continued operating from the Casablanca restaurant in Maspeth, the closed social clubs, the cars, and the remote locations, the ear-touching reference system, the cell structure that prevented any individual arrest from unraveling the whole, the family's presence in the labor unions that controlled construction, sanitation, and garment district work meant that a share of the cost of building in New York and hauling garbage in New York and shipping clothing through New York flowed through the organization in the form of payments, kickbacks, and no-show jobs. The loan sharking operations extended across Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. The stock manipulation schemes exploited the machinery of legitimate financial markets in ways that generated significant returns, with a profile that attracted far less federal attention than street crime. Massino held a share in a high-stakes dice game that Gotti had operated on Mott Street in Manhattan. The thing Massino had insisted on through all of this, the principle he had applied since the day he closed the last social club and told his men to touch their ears instead of saying his name, was that the organization needed to be invisible to be safe. He had watched every other major New York boss go to prison. He had watched them go to prison because they were visible, because they met in places law enforcement could surveil, because they talked on telephones that could be recorded, because they associated openly with people who could identify them and what they did. He had built his organization's survival on the deliberate rejection of all of those practices. The one thing he had used as a point of particular pride was the record of his family's internal silence. Since the founding of the organization, no made member of the Bonanno family had ever cooperated with the government as an informant. The other four families, over the decades, had produced their cooperating witnesses, their Sammy the Bull Gravanos and their Alphonse Darcos, men who had sat at the table and eventually decided to leave it. The Bonannos had not. Massino invoked this record as evidence of the organization's fundamental character, as proof that what he had built was different from what the other families had allowed to happen to themselves. The cracks that eventually appeared did not come from outside. They came from a decision Massino made in March of 1999 that he could not have known, at the time he made it, would be the decision that gave prosecutors their most powerful legal tool against him personally. Gerlando Ciascia had been one of the gunmen concealed in the closet at the 2020 nightclub on May 5th, 1981. He was a Sicilian-born captain who served as the connection between the Bonanno family and the Rizzuto crime organization in Montreal, and had been with Massino through the most decisive operation of the early part of his career. A conflict developed between Ciascia and another Bonanno captain, Anthony Grazzino, over the question of Grazzino's cocaine use. Ciascia's objections to what he saw as Grazzino's unreliability created a tension within the family's leadership. Massino backed Grazzino. The backing was decisive in the specific way that Massino's backing had always been decisive. In March of 1999, Ciascia was found in the Bronx, with 5 bullet wounds in his head and torso. He had been dumped there after the killing. The distinction that made the Ciascia murder different from every other murder that could be attributed to Massino was a legal one. In 1994, the federal law governing murder in furtherance of racketeering had been updated to include the death penalty for murders committed after that date. Every killing in Massino's record before 1994 fell under the older sentencing framework. The Ciascia murder did not. If Massino was convicted of ordering the killing of Gerlando Ciascia, the death penalty was a legally available outcome. The FBI had not been focused on Massino with its full resources since the commission trial of the mid-1980s. In 2000, a pair of forensic accountants who normally worked financial fraud cases were directed toward the Bonanno family's financial operations. Their investigation began to develop the documentary evidence of the organization's economic activities that prior investigations had not been able to assemble. The forensic approach bypassed the traditional methods that Massino's operational security had been designed to defeat. There were no bugs to place in social clubs that had been closed years earlier, no surveillance photographs of men entering and leaving a headquarters that no longer existed. The money, moving through accounts and businesses and union structures, left its own traces regardless. In 2002, a Bonanno captain named Frank Coppa, facing the prospect of a fraud conviction that would effectively sentence him to the rest of his life in prison, made the calculation that cooperation with the government was preferable to what awaited him otherwise. He became the first made man in the Bonanno family's entire history to break the oath he had taken and become a government informant. The family's record of internal silence, the record that Massino had invoked as evidence of the organization's fundamental discipline, was gone in a single decision. Coppa was followed by the acting underboss, Richard Cantarella, known as Shellackhead, who was facing racketeering and murder charges and whom Coppa's cooperation had implicated. Cantarella's cooperation was not a solo act. His wife and son cooperated alongside him. A third made man, Joseph D'Amico, followed. 3 cooperators with direct knowledge of the family's operations and its history of violence, each capable of providing the specifics that would unlock the next charge and the next witness. On the morning of January 9th, 2003, federal agents arrested Joseph Massino. The indictment was 19 counts, including conspiracy to commit the 1981 murder of Dominic Napolitano and multiple other killings spanning nearly 2 decades of organizational life. Massino was denied bail. He entered federal custody for the second time in his life, at 60 years old, facing charges that reflected the complete span of what he had done since the 1980s. Vincent Basciano, the acting boss he had designated, took over the day-to-day operations of the family in Massino's absence. From inside the federal detention facility in Brooklyn, where he was being held, Massino began to think about the situation his organization had created for him and what, if anything, could be done about it. The news about Vitale arrived in pieces. Massino had learned from the pattern of the indictment and the cooperators preceding it that his brother-in-law and longest partner was a potential problem. From federal custody, he put out word, to people who he believed were receptive, that Vitale needed to be killed. He used the same language he had used when ordering previous murders. He wanted to give Vitale a receipt. The word reached federal prosecutors before it reached anyone capable of acting on it. Prosecutors went to Vitale and told him what Massino had arranged. They also told him what Coppa and Cantarella had already said about Vitale's own involvement in various killings. Salvatore Vitale, who had known Massino for approximately 40 years, who had been at the 1981 triple murder as one of the gunmen, who had been present for or involved in virtually every significant event in Massino's criminal career, who had been used as the messenger and the trusted intermediary and the organizational buffer for decades, agreed to cooperate with the government. He admitted to 11 murders in the testimony he was preparing to give. He was the most valuable witness the prosecution had ever assembled against any Bonanno figure because he could cover Massino's complete criminal history from the inside and from the beginning. Other defendants in the case began calling Vitale by the nickname Fredo, after the character in the Godfather films, whose betrayal of his family became the defining act of his life. The FBI and the prosecution took the threat to Vitale's safety seriously enough to house Massino and Vitale in separate federal facilities, keeping them apart except when court appearances required proximity. James Tartaglione, another Bonanno associate who had anticipated his own indictment, had already agreed to wear a wire while he remained free, providing additional material for the prosecution's case. Massino's attorney, David Breitbart, built a defense around a strategy unusual for a mob case. He did not contest that Massino was the boss of the Bonanno crime family. He argued that the murders in the indictment had taken place before Massino assumed formal leadership of the family, and that the evidence reflected a man who, once he became boss, had shown a love of life because the murders had ceased. It was a narrow argument built on a thin premise. The prosecution's case was built on the testimony of the man who had known Massino longer than any other living person. The trial began on May 24th, 2004. Vitale's testimony covered every detail of Massino's criminal history that Vitale had been present for, which was essentially the complete record. The defense had a capable attorney, and the argument that the murders predated the period of Massino's formal leadership. It was not enough. On July 30th, 2004, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 11 counts. Massino sat with the verdict and did the arithmetic. A second trial was waiting for the Ciascia murder. That trial carried the death penalty, and the Attorney General's office had made clear it intended to proceed. 2 consecutive life sentences were the baseline outcome if the second trial went the same way the first one had. The death penalty was the alternative. Massino was 61 years old. He had diabetes and high blood pressure. He had a wife and 3 daughters. He had watched John Gotti die in federal custody 2 years earlier. He had watched every other boss of his generation go to prison and stay there. As court adjourned on July 30th, Massino requested a private meeting with Judge Nicholas Garaufis. In late September of 2004, Massino entered into a formal cooperation agreement with the federal government. The agreement required him to truthfully disclose his complete knowledge of the Bonanno family's activities and to assist in the prosecution of his former associates. In exchange, prosecutors would take the death penalty off the table for the Ciascia murder and would credit his cooperation toward a potential sentence reduction. He was moved to a federal detention facility in Brooklyn. He was given a recording device. He began meeting with Vincent Basciano, the man he had installed as acting boss, who was visiting him in the facility and discussing the family's operations with the confidence of someone speaking to the one person on earth he could trust completely. Over the following weeks, Basciano spoke freely. He described the murder of Randolph Pizzolo, a Bonanno associate who had drunkenly and publicly demanded induction into the family during a period when Basciano was consolidating his authority as acting boss. Pizzolo's conduct had been judged intolerable, and Basciano had given the order. He acknowledged this to Massino with the directness of a man explaining a management decision to his superior. On tape, Basciano explained the killing plainly. Pizzolo was a dangerous kid who did not listen. The recording captured everything. Prosecutors also reported that Massino had attempted, in the same meetings, to draw Basciano into discussing an alleged plot to have the lead prosecutor on Basciano's eventual case, Greg Andres, killed. The recording on that question was judged too ambiguous to use. The Pizzolo admission was not ambiguous at all. In October of 2004, Massino directed the FBI to the lot in Lindenwood, Ozone Park, Queens, where the bodies of Trinchera and Giaccone had been buried since May of 1981. Federal agents excavated the property and found what Massino had told them they would find: the remains of two of the three captains killed at the 2020 nightclub, along with the Piaget watch and the credit card that allowed the December 2004 identifications to be confirmed. The man who had arranged the burial in 1981 was now directing the excavation in 2004. In January of 2005, when Basciano was indicted for the Pizzolo murder, based on the recording, news reports identified the anonymous fellow mobster who had secretly captured the confession. By February, when the FBI's excavation of the Lindenwood lot confirmed Massino's role as their source, his cooperation was no longer anonymous in any meaningful sense. The public disgust of Massino's family at these identifications was documented in the accounts of the period. On June 23, 2005, Massino appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty to ordering the murder of Gerlando Schiascia. For this admission, combined with his 2004 conviction, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. That same day, Josephine Massino negotiated a settlement on the government's forfeiture claim. The settlement required turning over a cash of $7 million in cash that had been stored in the attic of the family's Howard Beach home, hundreds of gold bars found in the same location, and the Casablanca restaurant, along with other real estate holdings. Josephine was permitted to keep the Howard Beach house and some rental properties. The restaurant, where the family meeting of January 2000 had been held, where the boss of the Bonanno crime family had once seated his guests personally and explained what he had cooked that evening, became a federal forfeiture. The cooperation that had produced the Basciano recording and the Lindenwood excavation continued to generate prosecutorial results for years. Basciano's first racketeering trial in 2006 produced a conviction on attempted murder and illegal gambling charges, but ended in a hung jury on the murder of a Gambino-associated man named Frank Santoro. The prosecution retried him on the Santoro murder counts. On August 1st, 2007, Basciano was convicted of the Santoro killing and sentenced to life imprisonment. The family that Massino had rebuilt from nothing had now produced 3 consecutive bosses facing life sentences, with Massino himself as the second, having succeeded the imprisoned Rastelli. In 2011, Massino was called to the witness stand in a new prosecution of Basciano that included murder charges carrying the potential for the death penalty. He testified about the oath he had taken at his own induction ceremony into the Bonanno family in 1977, the oath that had organized his understanding of his obligations for 3 decades. He told the court what that oath required. Once a bullet leaves that gun, you never talk about it. He was on the stand because he was talking about everything. He testified about his duties as boss. The answer he gave was 2 words: murder and making captains. He testified that his cooperation had spared his wife from prosecution and had allowed her to keep their home. He testified that the arrangement he had made with the government had served his interests. Basciano was convicted of murder, in that 2011 proceeding. On June 23, 2013, Massino appeared before Judge Nicholas Garofis in Brooklyn Federal Court for resentencing. The judge, reviewing the extent of his cooperation across 9 years, credited the 10.5 years Massino had served since his arrest as sufficient time served. He was resentenced to time served and released on supervised release for the remainder of his natural life. Massino told the court that he prayed every night for those he had hurt and for their families. He shook his attorney's hand. He thanked the judge. He walked out of federal court in Brooklyn under supervised release, 70 years old, on a summer afternoon in 2013, the first boss of a New York crime family ever to have cooperated with the federal government, and the last man standing from the world that had made him. Joseph Massino died on September the 14th, 2023, at a rehabilitation facility in Glen Cove, Long Island, following a short illness complicated by the diabetes and other chronic conditions that had accompanied him through his final decades. He was 80 years old. His funeral was a private affair attended only by family members. The location of his burial was kept undisclosed because of ongoing concerns about his safety arising from his cooperation, concerns that had not diminished in the 20 years since the cooperation began. No official obituaries or acknowledgments emerged from the world of organized crime. The absence of formal recognition from the circles that had once commanded his complete loyalty was itself a document of what his decisions had made him in that world's accounting. The story of Joseph Massino offers two different ways of being understood, and neither of them is simple. The first is the story of a man who achieved something genuinely unusual in the history of American organized crime. He took a family that had been expelled from the commission, humiliated by a 6-year federal infiltration, and declared effectively finished by both law enforcement and the other 4 families, and rebuilt it into the most disciplined and operationally secure criminal organization in the country. He did it by applying principles of silence and invisibility in organizational structure that his contemporaries could observe but could not execute with the same consistency. He did it by watching what destroyed other men and refusing to do those things. He did it by running a restaurant in Maspeth, Queens, and greeting his guests himself, and by never appearing in the newspaper, and by insisting that the people around him touched their ear rather than speak his name, and by holding his family meetings in cars in foreign countries and moving vehicles instead of social clubs that the FBI could bug. The second is the story of a man who, when the calculation changed, calculated differently. He did not break in the way his world would have preferred to understand it, in weakness or confusion or ignorance of what the oath he had taken required. He understood exactly what the oath required. He had explained what it required in a federal courtroom, quoting the specific language of the ceremony where he had taken it. He made a different calculation, based on the death penalty he was facing, and the years of prison that lay ahead, and the specific mathematics of what cooperation could produce, and he executed that calculation with the same precision he had brought to everything else he had ever done. John Gotti, his friend and neighbor, chose visibility and became the most famous mob boss in American history, and died in a federal prison cell in June of 2002. Joseph Massino chose invisibility and became the most powerful mob boss of his era, and died in a rehabilitation facility in Glen Cove, Long Island, in September of 2023, 21 years later, having served as the most consequential government witness the Bonanno crime family ever produced against itself. One man was famous, one man was invisible. Both of them ended up with the specific differences that individual circumstances produce in roughly the same place. What the story reveals about the era is this: the conditions that made Massino's authority possible, the organizational depth, the institutional discipline, the willingness of enough people to hold their silence for long enough to build something that lasted, were ending at precisely the moment he was at his peak. The cooperators who came after 2002 were not an aberration or a failure of will. They were the product of a legal environment in which the federal government had learned to make cooperation attractive enough and prison sentences sufficiently long that the calculation which had always favored silence was beginning to shift for everyone who had to make it. Massino understood this system better than anyone in his world. He had built his entire organization around defeating it. When it caught him anyway, and when the death penalty was on the table for a murder that postdated the 1994 law change, he applied his understanding of the system to the core problem of his own survival with the same efficiency he had applied to everything else. The restaurant in Maspeth is gone. The lunch wagon is long gone. The lot in Lindenwood, where the three captains were buried for 23 years, is an ordinary urban lot in Ozone Park, Queens. The organization that Massino rebuilt operates today in a form that reflects what three consecutive bosses facing life sentences and one unprecedented cooperation agreement have produced, which is a fraction of what it was. The world that made the man who built all of it and then dismantled it from within is gone in all the ways that matter. What remains is the record, the dates and the names, and the specific chain of decisions, one after another, that produced the most complete act of organizational self-destruction in the history of the five families, executed by the one man who had spent 30 years making the best available argument that such a thing was impossible.